We lose more Americans in 1 year to illicit fentanyl poisoning than we lost during the entire Vietnam War. My son, Jimmy Woody, was poisoned with illicit fentanyl on Halloween 2021. He thought he was buying heroin, and he was given pure fentanyl. He was a brilliant musician, brilliant. He started off playing violin in the 4th grade, and then when we moved from Raytown, Missouri to Southwest Missouri, we moved to a district that did not have an orchestra program. So right in the middle of the year, they switched him to tenor saxophone, and I didn't think he would do well being behind the other kids, but he picked it right up. And then he wanted an electric guitar, which he worked to buy that himself. I bought him a keyboard. We bought him a bass guitar. He could play any instrument he picked up, self-taught. At the age of 16, he started composing music. I used to say it was kind of like a mix between metal and Mozart. He always lived, we bonded over music. There was a time, he was about 13, he came in my room, he said, "Hey Mom, I found this show called Metal Mania on VH1, and it was on twice a week, and we watched it together." And I'd say, "Oh yeah, I've seen them in concert, I've seen them in concert." And we just always bonded over music. And, you know, like I said, he started composing, and his story, I used to point to Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue as a role model for him, because they both wrote awesome rock and roll songs. They both played bass guitar. They both formed a band. They both became addicted to heroin, but Jimmy didn't have the happy ending that Nikki Sixx has had. One day he experimented with drugs in high school, and, you know, smoking pot, and then I guess he got caught up in pills. And one day this predator went to one of their band practices, and the story I've been told is that he said, "You know, for what you guys are all spending $100 on pills, I could get you the same high for $20 with heroin." And his bandmates said from that day forward, every time they came to band practice, Jimmy had heroin. And he was a very functioning addict. I didn't even know about his addiction for 4 years. He was addicted to heroin for 4 years, and I didn't even know it. And I gave him a ride to work every day and babysat his stepsons. And I didn't even know. He was very functioning. And then the last 2 years of his addiction was when he switched to IV drug use, and he told me about it, and we started trying to get him some help. In fact, he did get to a point where he was ready for help and wanted to get clean, and I found a detox facility that he could get into without insurance, and I got him in there, and the next day his dealer went and got him out. His dealer drove the 70 miles to lure him out of rehab because he didn't want to lose that income. And he talked my son into leaving. He even offered him a free shot or whatever of heroin to leave, to end his withdrawal. And he said, you know, "Oh, I'm the only one who cares about you. You know, your mom just wants to see you suffer." And that day was the first day in my life my heart experienced genuine hatred. I hated that man. My favorite thing to do in the world is to share his music. For a long time, I said I wanted his legacy to be his music because it's really good. And I wanted him to be remembered for his music, not for how he died. But I have lots of videos on YouTube of his performances, and the videos on YouTube that are aimed towards fentanyl awareness get so much more visibility. But I love to share his music, I do. I'm very proud of him, for his talent. Halloween night 2021. He left work at 10 p.m. and his dealer lived in a town 30 minutes away. He arrived at a Halloween party back in our town at 11 o'clock, so there was a 1-hour time frame there. At approximately 10:30, he called his drummer from a phone that the drummer didn't recognize. And when the drummer told me the number, it was Jimmy's dealer's girlfriend. So he was with his dealer's girlfriend at 10:30, right before he showed up at his drummer's house, also in that same town. So he was with her. He was in that town. And then he showed up at the Halloween party at 11 and told his guitar player that he had just picked up some heroin from his regular dealer's house, and they had to run to the store for something, so he asked his guitar player if he wanted to snort a line of this. Now, he knew his guitar player was just an occasional heroin user. And there had been an incident prior to that where he had to call 911 because he thought his guitar player had overdosed, but it ended up they didn't even have to Narcan him. It had more to do with the combination of alcohol is why he had passed out. So I'm sure what my son thought, after his guitar player snorted that line of heroin, he collapsed at the party. And I'm sure my son thought that it was, again, more alcohol related because he'd been at the party for a while. They rushed him to the hospital, the guitar player to the hospital. And someone gave my son a ride home, and he went home and shot up the same stuff that he had just picked up and let his guitar player snort a line of. It wasn't until after the funeral that his guitar player told me his lab work at the hospital showed fentanyl and no heroin. But when I can't prove my son's anything in a court of law with the drummer's phone records and the guitar player's lab work. But because of my son's addiction, it wasn't uncommon for him to not return my calls or texts all day on his days off. The next day was his day off. And I texted him a few times. He texted me at 1:05 after he got home. I didn't know he was home from the party yet. He texted me at 1:05 a.m. and I texted him back at 1:20 a.m. I don't know if he ever read my last text to him. But the next day, I texted him a few times. He hadn't responded. I didn't think anything of it. And then when my younger son, who was also in the band, came over, he told me that the guitar player was in the hospital and what had happened at the party the night before. And I said, oh. I had to go do wellness checks on my son before when he hadn't answered my call. And I had tried to impress upon him what that did to me as a mother, to have to drive over to his house not knowing what I would find. And this time, I honestly expected him to be okay. I didn't think he would be. I thought he was just asleep. So I had a key, but I didn't have to use it because the door was unlocked. I went into his apartment. It was an upstairs apartment. Went up the stairs and through his front room, and I saw him, what I thought was nodded off. He was sitting like Indian style with his head forward on the floor. And I thought he was just nodded off. And I walked over and I reached down to touch his shoulder to wake him up, expecting it to be soft and warm, but it was cold and stiff. And I watch a lot of crime documentaries, and I had to get out of there. I had to run. And I feel bad for that because I wish I'd told him. But also I'm glad I didn't see his face because I think that would have been even more traumatizing than finding your child. That's hard. Finding your child deceased is hard. I immediately called 911. And it went through a series of clicks and went dead. I called 911 again. And it went through another series of clicks. And then I heard, Vernon County 911, what is your emergency? Well, I don't live in Vernon County. That's the next county over. But I said, my son is dead. And she said, what's your address? And I told her the address. And she said, well, ma'am, you've called Vernon County 911. I said, I called 911. I mean, she was scolding me for it. And she said, well, I'll notify El Dorado Springs PD and they may call you. I said, they may call me? So I then called my husband and told him, Jimmy's dead. And not knowing what I needed to do to get the police to come there, I have a friend who's a paramedic. And I thought, she'll know how to get the police. So I called her. I said, Jimmy's dead. I can't get the police to come. Can you get through to them? She said, what's the address? And by that time, I was outside. She pulled up exactly 2 minutes later and said, where's he at? I said, upstairs. She went flying up the stairs with Narcan, not realizing he'd been dead for 17 hours. So she called the police, and they finally showed up. One police officer and one sheriff, and they asked what had happened, and I said, my son was addicted to heroin, and I came to check on him, and he's dead. And they went upstairs, and they came back downstairs. He said, ma'am, we need you to leave, and we need to know what funeral home you want him taken to. And I said, funeral home? I haven't even thought about that, you know. And I'm not from there, but my husband is. So I called him and said, what funeral home should he be taken to? And he gave me the name of one. So I told the police that, and they just kept saying, we need you to leave. We need you. Well, it's because he was bent over and he was in full rigor, you know. So they were going to have to bring him out like that. And they kept saying, we need you to leave. And, okay, I'm leaving. They said, do you need someone to drive you? I said, no, fine, I'll go. And I got in my car and I left. And my daughter was coming up from Springfield. We'd gotten a hold of her, and my friend, the paramedic, came to the house a full hour later, and she had all of these messages from the police. You know, things that they could have told me while I was there, but they didn't. And the first was that we needed to go back over there and secure any valuables because there was a broken window. Okay. Next, you need to go to the funeral home tomorrow morning and make the funeral arrangements, okay? Next, you can come to the police department the next morning and pick up your son's personal property that we've confiscated, you know, phone, wallet, etc., okay? And if you want an autopsy, you'll have to request one and pay for it yourself, and a toxicology report will only show positive for opiates. It won't specify which one. It didn't occur to me until several months later. I thought, how did they know it was opiates? Because I had told them that he was addicted to heroin. So they were making that assumption. So the next morning, as we were preparing to go to the funeral home, an officer who went to school with my son came by the house to express his condolences. And he asked me if I would consent to letting them access information on Jimmy's phone so that they could, you know, pursue charging the supplier. I said, absolutely. He said, okay, well, I'm going out of town for a wedding. I'll be gone for a few days. I'll get in touch with you when I get back. He was actually going on 2 weeks reserve training. And after 5 days, I was tired of not hearing anything from him. And I wanted to know what was on my son's phone. So I went and got his personal property. And it verified who the supplier was. I already knew who the supplier was. So in the meantime, I just assumed it was heroin. And there are so many people who either, I know some stories where the police tell, oh, your child overdosed on heroin, or your child overdosed on drugs or whatever. And the parents don't know to investigate. We assume the police know what they're doing. We assume they're doing their job. We trust them. We grow up with officer friendly, the good. We just believe what they say. We have no reason not to question what they've told us. So it never occurred to me to ask any questions until the guitar player told me that his lab work at the hospital was fentanyl and no heroin. But Jimmy had told him he had just picked up heroin. And someone asked me later, they said, "Okay, how do you know that Jimmy didn't know he was using fentanyl?" I said, because he gave his guitar player, someone he'd been friends with since junior high band, written songs with, formed a band with, he gave him an entire line of it to snort. He wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have killed his friend. So when I went and picked up his personal property at the police station, I asked one of the officers, I said, what was his official cause of death? He said, you'll have to ask the coroner. Well, that was on Saturday night. I had found him on a Monday night, and we buried him on a Monday. So I called the coroner on Tuesday, and I said, what was my son's official cause of death? And she said, well, it had to have been an accidental drug overdose. There was no suicide note. I said, well, what did he overdose on, prime rib? And she said, well, my deputy coroner wasn't able to get a blood specimen. I said, well, there's still some on his apartment floor that I haven't cleaned up yet. And she, oh, it would have to be fresh blood. Okay, I see. Well, later I was told by another officer that the deputy coroner is not certified to draw blood. She told me that they did, however, send the syringe that was found laying next to my son to the lab, and it would take about 4 weeks to get that back. I gave her 8 weeks, and I called her and I said, did you happen to get the results back on the syringe, of the contents? And she was clearly annoyed. She was looking around, said, they're around here somewhere. I don't know. What difference does it make? What difference does it make? So I proceeded to attempt to file a formal complaint against her, for one, for talking to me like that so flippantly about the death of my child, and for not collecting the evidence to prove what killed him. Like I said, you can't prove the lead singer and bass player's death by the drummer's phone records and the guitar player's lab work. So I started doing an unbelievable amount of research on death certification and autopsies and whatnot, and calling the state, and I ended up filing a formal complaint with the director of the Missouri Coroners and Medical Examiners Association, and when I didn't get a response back from her, I sent a follow-up email, because I had called her, and at the time she said, send me a detailed email with all of this information that you've just told me, and I can use that as a formal complaint. So I sent a follow-up email, and I said, did you receive my email? And she responded back and said, yes, unfortunately, because she's an elected official, she cannot be reprimanded. Okay. Well, I started doing a little bit more research on coroners and medical examiners and death certification, and learned that all death certificates should have an ICD-10 code. The International Classification of Diseases that's set by the World Health Organization. Every illness or injury has an ICD-10 code. And for that ICD-10 code, there has to be a toxicology. My son's death certificate does not have an ICD-10 code. It just says accidental drug overdose. No drug specified. According to the Centers for Disease Control and the Missouri Department of Health, there has never, ever been a drug death in Cedar County, Missouri. Ever. I have a death certificate that says otherwise, but because she didn't report the death properly, it didn't get a code, therefore it didn't get recorded in vital statistics. They call them vital statistics for a reason. They're important. One of the reasons that people are not paying attention to this this crisis is because these deaths aren't being reported properly. So I continued to research the death certification and death reporting, and came across a story where someone had horribly botched this man's child's death certificate, and he went on a mission, and he got the governor of Missouri to sign a law establishing a committee to create standardized training for coroners in the state of Missouri, because there is none. And the governor signed this law, and he filled all but 2 of the positions on this committee and has done nothing since. It's been 3 years. So in the state of Missouri, coroners have no education requirements whatsoever. They get no formal training once they're elected, and they have no consequences for doing whatever they want. That's a problem. That's a big problem. How many fentanyl deaths out there have not been recorded accurately? A lot of times on death certificates, they put cardiac arrest. Do you know what cardiac arrest means? It means the heart stopped. That's not a cause of death, that's a result of death. I have very strong opinions about how death certification should be handled. There's a manner of death and a cause of death. The cause in these cases should be fentanyl toxicity. The manner of death should be left undetermined. Coroners don't have access to the evidence necessary to rule it a homicide. A lot of people say, oh, the death certificate should say homicide. The evidence to prove that a toxicity death is homicide is in the possession of the police. That's their responsibility. But the coroners also don't have the evidence to determine that it's accidental. They have no evidence. They have the body, but they always put accidental. They should put undetermined as the manner of death. And one reason this is a huge problem is because a lot of law enforcement officers, they will tell the family, first of all, they always say, well, we can't even begin an investigation until we get the autopsy results. Then when they get the autopsy results, they'll say, well, the coroner put accidental, so we can't investigate. We can't investigate it as a homicide because the coroner said it was accidental. Bullshit. Bullshit. So that system needs a complete overhaul, and everything that pertains to death certification is guidelines. Guidelines are synonymous with suggestions. I used to work for the federal government. I'm very familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations. Regulations is synonymous with requirements. There are no requirements for death certification. That needs to be corrected. That needs to change. And it's a problem. The statistics are not even close to accurate. I'm sure you're familiar with Jim Raw with the Families Against Fentanyl. He analyzed the CDC's data, and he was the one who determined that fentanyl poisoning is now the #1 cause of death in Americans age 18 to 45, which that window is now changed. But the CDC didn't do that analysis. A bereaved father had to do that analysis. September 11th, 3,000 Americans were killed on U.S. soil under a terrorist attack. 3,000. As a nation, we responded, we reacted. I don't think so. You are not going to come on U.S. soil and murder 3,000 Americans and get away with it. We retaliated. We went after them. We fought back. Why aren't we doing that now? Why are we allowing foreign terrorists to murder over 100,000 Americans every year? This administration is like Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burned. La, 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 looking the other way, doesn't care. I used to look at social media as being pure entertainment. You know, my philosophy with social media was if I can't laugh at it or headbang to it, I don't want it in my newsfeed. You know, I would unfollow anyone who posted anything political or, you know, the little nieces with their little depressive, you know, and I didn't want to see that in my newsfeed. This is for my entertainment. Well, then my daughter had 2 children, and then she started neglecting and eventually abandoned them. And I joined some grandparents raising grandchildren groups because I was then raising them. And then I found out about my son's addiction and was trying to help him. And so I joined some kind of you know, Al-Anon, Nar-Anon type groups, you know, to support groups for family members with a loved one in active addiction. And then my son died. So I joined some grief support groups. And then I found out it was fentanyl. And I found Lost Voices of Fentanyl, and I put it in park. I mean, I learned so much in that group. The founder, April Babcock, and the co-president, Virginia Krieger, are so knowledgeable about this epidemic. And I just watched video after video, and I just read through all the posts, and there was so much information there. And I learned so much about this. And I also got involved in drug-induced homicide because every link in the supply chain needs to be held accountable. From China providing the precursor chemicals to the Mexican cartels who should be labeled foreign terrorist organizations to Joe Blow, the drug dealer on the corner. Every link in the supply chain needs to be held accountable for the deaths they're causing. And I face unique challenges, like because I'm raising my grandchildren, my grief always has to get put on the back burner. The work I do fighting fentanyl always has to get put on the back burner. The big rally we have in DC every year, 2 years ago, I couldn't go because I had no one to watch my grandchildren. I have to pack a diaper bag with toys and snacks to go put flowers on my son's grave. And I have 2 little kids with me. I had this thought, and I went into some of the grief support groups because I noticed some of them were talking about raising their grandchildren. And I noticed in some of the grandparents groups, some of them were talking about grieving the loss of a child. And I thought, so I asked in one of each of those groups, would anyone be interested in a group that is for grandparents raising grandchildren while grieving the loss of a child? And the response was overwhelming. So I started a group for that. Now, in my case, I'm raising my daughter's children, but it was my son who died. But in a lot of cases, they're what I call fentanyl grand families. Grand families is the term for grandparents raising grandchildren. They're fentanyl grand families. They're created because when someone is poisoned with fentanyl and they have children, those fentanyl orphans have to be raised by someone. Sometimes they have grandparents that can step in and do that. And I say, these are 2 challenges that none of us ever plan for. We plan for our old age. We plan for retirement. Nobody plans on burying a child. Nobody plans on raising their grandchildren. Individually, these are difficult challenges. Facing them together is very hard. Some of these fentanyl orphans don't have a grandparent alive or available. Some of the grandparents are in active addiction. They end up in the foster system. 20 years ago, my sister worked for the Western Missouri Department of Mental Health. She worked at a group home for adolescent boys. And she told me most of the residents there did not have a diagnosis. They were unwanted foster kids. Nobody wants to adopt a teenage boy or foster a teenage boy. So the state didn't have any place else to put them but a mental hospital. That's where they spend their teen years. And then when they turn 18, the state kicks them to the curb. We are setting up the next generation for being at risk for substance use disorder. This is destroying multiple generations. You know, this wasn't what I wanted to do at this point in my life. I wanted to grow roses and listen to rock and roll. I didn't want to have to go march to the White House and raise my grandchildren. And even though they didn't lose a father, their uncle was very involved in their life. My grandchildren loved their uncle. And my grandson kept asking me, why is Uncle Jimmy dead? How is he? He was 3. He was 3 and his sister was 2 when they lost their uncle. And he was a part of their daily life. And we had recently watched Snow White. So the best way I could explain it to him was just like the evil witch gave Snow White the poisonous apple, the bad man gave Uncle Jimmy poison. And that was the only way I could explain it to him. And then I got the idea to create a meme for it. And it went viral. It went viral really quick. And it seems to be the only way to explain to some people the difference between poison and overdose. He got something he didn't ask for and it killed him. That's not an overdose. In order for it to be an overdose, there has to be a safe dose to go over. There's no safe dose of any illicit drug. None. When my niece was little, my sister-in-law took her to the doctor, and then she brought her back, and she had to take her to my mother-in-law to be babysat because she had to go to work. My mother-in-law, not realizing that she'd already been given Tylenol at the doctor's office, gave her a multi-symptom cold medicine that had acetaminophen in it. She overdosed her on acetaminophen, and she actually had to be taken to the hospital. She gave her a double dose of acetaminophen. Had that killed her, her death certificate would have said acetaminophen toxicity, poisoning. Dosing is something that occurs outside of the body. The toxicity is what occurs inside the body. One of the problems with the word overdose is the stigma that it causes. When you hear someone, like a news reporter, talking about overdose, they don't even realize how stupid they sound when they're giving a news report and talk about this infant that overdosed. What? As soon as people hear the word overdose, they subconsciously envision the stereotypical junkie, or what we have going on in Kensington or San Francisco. They subconsciously envision that, and their compassion gets shut off. Right before our rally, the toddler in the Bronx at the daycare that died, all those toddlers that came in contact with it, there was a baby once that the nanny had taken the baby to the park, and they somehow came in contact with it at the park. We had a toddler that came in contact with it in an Airbnb. It's not just druggies or junkies dying. We recently had the kids, I believe it was in Virginia, 7 elementary students, because one of the other children brought gummy bears to school, candy, in a used baggie that had fentanyl in it. We've got to do something about this. And this is why I choose to fight supply, and my organization focuses on supply. Because just having more treatment and recovery centers or whatever, just addressing demand isn't going to save those lives, okay? I have lots of friends who lost a child at the age of 13, 14, 15. My son was 29, okay? That journey from experimenting for the first time to being a 29-year-old IV heroin user and seeking treatment and recovery, it's like trying to walk across a landmine field. Most people aren't going to survive that journey. Jimmy wouldn't have lived as long as he did had fentanyl been on the scene in the earlier years of his experimentation. Every time someone purchases from a new supplier, they're taking a risk. Their supplier gets from a different supplier. Most people will not survive that journey. Most people won't survive long enough to ever reach being ready for treatment and recovery. We have got to stop the supply that is killing people, innocent people, children, babies. Lost Voices of Fentanyl, we currently have 31,800 members. And we're on Facebook. We also have a website, lvof.org. We have annual rallies in Washington, D.C. July 13th, we will rally at the Washington Monument and march to the White House. We have a huge turnout. Everyone should be there. Everyone who has lost a child should be there. Drug-induced homicide, we have got to change the way these deaths are handled. They should all be, every suspected drug overdose should be thoroughly investigated as a homicide. All evidence should be collected. The police should be looking at these phones. With today's technology, you can look in somebody's phone and find out everything they've done. You know, some of them won't even try. I know some of them run into, when they have the iPhones, the newer iPhones, they're locked or whatever. There's a company, the police can download that data. They can download data off a phone if they want to. They don't want to, they don't care. There's a stigma. No. Anyway, the Lost Voices of Fentanyl, the Facebook group, the website, lvof.org, Drug-Induced Homicide Foundation. It has a public group and a public page. It's on Facebook. They also have a website, Drug-Induced Homicide Foundation. It was started by a woman who was formerly a Chicago police officer, and her daughter was poisoned, and her own police department wasn't investigating her daughter's death, and she realized what a problem that was, and she's built this huge foundation. It's wonderful. And also my group, which is it's still small, it's growing. Grandparents Raising Grandchildren While Grieving the Loss of a Child. That's on Facebook. Just search for it, you can find it. And remember those two terms, fentanyl orphans and fentanyl grandfamilies. People get really offended when I say that. When I say fentanyl orphans, they'll, oh, that just sounds so horrible. Do you have to call them orphans? Is it upsetting? Is it disturbing? Good. It needs to be upsetting. It needs to upset people. People need to get upset about these poor children that are growing up without their parents.